The long-awaited story expansion for Resident Evil 8 Village, titled Shadows of Rose, just came out today, and I just played all of it, and I'm about to give you my thoughts on it. But before I do, this video is going to be full of spoilers. I was thinking about doing, half non-spoilers and then half spoilers, but this is a shorter DLC, and you really can't talk about it without getting into spoilers. But if you want to know, I do think that you should play it. Like my title says, this is a expansion done right. So go play it. And then after you play it, come back and watch this. Also, consider subscribing. I do TV show discussions, movie discussions, trailer reactions, that sort of thing. But I also love survival horror gaming, and I talk about it a lot on this page. Specifically, Resident Evil, I talk about a lot. I actually have a Resident Evil playlist on this page you should check out. It's my favorite video game franchise of all time. I already did a video on my first impressions for Village third-person gameplay, and I did our reverse review, so you should check those out. But anyway, enough talking. Let's talk about Shadows of Rose. Once again, this video will have spoilers, so if you haven't played Shadows of Rose yet, I do recommend you go play it and then you come back and watch this. But anyway, let's get into it. First, I'm going to talk about gameplay, and then I'm going to talk about my thoughts on the narrative. So gameplay-wise, this very much feels like Resident Evil 8 Village. No surprise there, it is technically a DLC for Village, but it does change things up. And it changes things up quite a bit to the point where, as I was playing this, and my biggest takeaway from this game is when I go back and I think about Shadows of Rose, I'm going to think about it more as like a mini spin-off game, as opposed to a DLC. Because yes, like most DLCs, it does reuse assets. You are going around Lady Dimitrescu's castle, you're going around Donna's house, you're going around parts of the village. Everything you see in this game, more or less, you saw in Village. But I'm really impressed with how Capcom changed it, despite it being familiar. Like most DLCs, maybe will change the time of day of the areas you've already visited, or change the season or something like that, or just change the NPCs. Capcom really changes this up because, again, you've been through this castle. Everywhere you're going feels familiar, but the way you go about the castle and the way you get from one area to the other feels so different that it's almost like rediscovering it for the first time. For gunplay, Rose has a handgun and she has a shotgun. And that's pretty much all you have for weapons, unless I missed one, which is possible. I tend to not notice a lot of things in games. But that handgun and that shotgun is pretty much more than enough. If you know how to utilize your ammo, if you know how to run away from enemies, if you really know how to be stealthy at some points, you can get through this game pretty easily with the amount of resources that they give you. And I want to talk about stealth. There is quite a bit of stealth in this game, actually, which I was not surprising, because Resident Evil is a lot of things, but a stealth game, it rarely, if ever, is. But also on top of that, as you may have seen from some of the trailers, and as you see in some of the gameplay that I'm showing you, Rose has some powers, and those powers get upgraded as you progress in the game, and those powers, come the end, are really cool. And I really hope that we get to play as Rose again as a main character in a mainline Resident Evil game, a game much longer than this, because playing with her powers is so fun. It adds so many different gameplay mechanics to this Resident Evil universe that we've never gotten before. But despite having all of these powers, she still doesn't feel overpowered, which I'm personally really thankful for, because at first, when I started this game, when I saw some of the trailers, I thought she was going to feel overpowered, but she doesn't, because she doesn't really know how to use a gun, obviously, but her gun skills are as good as the player, whoever's playing as her. But also the fact that she's just a 16-year-old girl, you know what I mean? She's not necessarily the most physically powerful of the Resident Evil characters. You're not going to be boulder punching people like Chris Redfield. So it's kind of a good balance. She has these powers to get her through in ways that other characters wouldn't be able to, but her on a more human level is a bit weaker, so it does balance out. Now I want to talk about the length of Shadows of Rose. It took me 3 hours and 42 minutes to beat this DLC. Now, normally it takes me a bit longer than most people to beat games. I don't necessarily take my time and explore every single aspect of the map. Honestly, I kind of do, but I don't do it to the extent of some players. For example, Resident Evil 3 Remake, most people said it took them about 4 to 4.5 hours to beat that. It took me, I think, 7 hours. And yes, a good portion of that is because I do typically suck at video games, but still, this DLC was a lot longer than I was expecting. And I'm honestly really happy with the length, because it didn't feel too short, but it also didn't feel like it overstayed its welcome, which as the game was progressing and as I was getting further into the game, I thought thought that it was going to run the risk of maybe, you know, treading the same water a bit too much and it was going to start to feel stale, but thankfully that never actually happened. But again, despite the fact that it didn't overstay its welcome, it still feels perfect in length. It's lengthy, you know what I mean? I've played every Resident Evil DLC there is, and most of them, despite them being good, I'm sure if you're a Resident Evil fanatic, you agree, most Resident Evil DLCs, story DLCs especially, are pretty good, pretty entertaining, pretty fun. The Hunk DLC in Resident Evil 2, obviously Lost in Nightmares in Resident Evil 5, those sort of things, Desperate Escape, once again from Resident Evil 5, Separate Ways in Resident Evil 4. They're fun, but they're often pretty short, you know what I mean? Like, I think Lost in Nightmares and Desperate Escape from Resident Evil 5, you can get through those probably in about 30 to 45 minutes a piece. And then, like, Not a Hero from Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, I think takes maybe an hour max. But Shadows of Rose really does feel more like Separate Ways did in Resident Evil 4. It really does feel like a mini campaign. It doesn't just feel like DLC. It feels like its own self-contained Resident Evil game. And I was honestly, again, really surprised with that. This DLC, this expansion, has all the makings of a Resident Evil game. You're looking for keys, you're solving puzzles, you're backtracking, you're exploring a good portion of the castle. I'd say you explore about 60 to 70% of that castle from Village, if memory serves me correctly. You get a couple boss fights. There's not that many enemy types, but the enemy types are creepy and really freaky. If I had to give this DLC one flaw, it's when you get to Donna's house. If you remember Donna from Village, she's the lord that has the puppets and you do the weird puzzles in her house and that weird freaky baby comes at you. When you first get there, it really did feel like doing the same thing over again, because when you're in that house, you're solving a puzzle as Ethan, you're going around the rooms, doors get locked and then unlocked, and it's kind of creepy. And when you get there as Rose in this DLC, it feels like you're essentially doing the same puzzle, just kind of with a reskin on it. But luckily, that's a very, very short portion of this DLC. And then when you get deeper into Donna's house, oh boy, it's probably the most memorable part of this entirety of Resident Evil Village. Honestly, it was freaky, it was horrifying. Those dolls, those mannequins scared me shitless. I'd say it's scarier. I'd say that that's probably scarier than anything in Village. Maybe not as scary as the baby, but it rivals that baby, at least for me personally. And I can only imagine how scary that would have been in first person, which is kind of odd. When I was playing through Village, I was hoping we'd get a third person mode for it, and I'm glad that we do. I'm not sure which one's going to be better. I've yet to really dive into Village in third person. But now that I've played Shadows of Rose in third person, I would love it if they made a first person mode for that, because that would be horrifying. And it would be really cool with Rose's powers as well. Now I want to get into more of the story side of this. The story is what interested me the most when I was getting into Shadows of Rose. It picks up 16 years after the events of Resident Evil 8 Village, so Rose is 16 years old, and she decides to go into the Metamycete. I think that's what it's called. I apologize if I mispronounced that. But she goes into that consciousness in order to try and rid herself of the powers that the mold has given her, because those powers have dampened her whole life. People make fun of her. She gets no friends. She really does not want those powers. And when she gets into the world, she's essentially put through the ringer by everyone in order to get this crystal, and the crystal will take away her powers. The Masked Duke plays a big role, and then believe it or not, you know who comes back? Again, spoiler alert, but Evelyn from Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. I was really happy to see her be in this DLC and to further tie the two games together and to further, you know, it's a nice little bow on the overall Winters story. Biohazard, Village, and now Shadows of Rose. And her boss fight was honestly really memorable, and I really was not expecting her to be in it, and I'm really, really happy that she was. And this entirety of this DLC actually reminded me of the Lucas segment from Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, when he's kind of talking to you through the intercoms and making you go through these like escape room type scenarios. Kind of this whole DLC feels like that. Rose is trying to get this crystal and everyone is making her do all these crazy tasks. But one of my favorite aspects of the story, as cliche as it may sound, is this character of Michael. And Michael is these words that appear on the wall and they assist Rose. They give her advice, they give her tips, they give her motivation, they seem to care about her. There's this weird mystique about this Michael person. And again, getting into spoilers here. At first, I thought that it was going to be Ethan. You know what I mean? Because why wouldn't it be? It's her dad. His consciousness is trapped in this world. And why wouldn't he help his daughter? And then I thought that might be a bit too obvious. And I thought maybe it was going to be Mother Miranda trying to help Rose get rid of her powers to, you know, defeat Rose, maybe. But then it did turn out that Michael, these words on the walls, were Ethan. It really was as basic as it sounded. But I'm not really complaining because it did pay off emotionally, at least for me personally. I don't know why. It maybe was obvious to others, but I really was not expecting to see Ethan in this game as an actual character. And I'm really, really glad that he was, because that's where the big emotional payoff of this DLC comes from. When Rose finally meets her dad, when she finally gets to, you know, talk to him at least a little bit, and to know that he was the one that was helping her out throughout her entire duration in this crazy twisted world. I think it pays off really, really well, and I liked it. And Rose as a character, I'm not gonna say that she's one of the best written video game characters ever, but I did really enjoy her. I enjoyed her more than I thought I was going to. And like Ethan, a lot of people didn't like Ethan. I loved Ethan ever since Biohazard, but I liked him even more in Village. And now I think Ethan deserves a spot amongst the greatest Resident Evil names. You know what I mean? Chris, Leon, I think Ethan Winters deserves to be there. And based on this DLC, I think Rose has incredible potential as a main character. And it's just a matter of time before she's mentioned amongst the likes of Claire and Jill and Ada and all the great Resident Evil characters. My biggest question mark about the narrative isn't necessarily about the main plot of this game, but just the implications that it has over the overall Resident Evil universe. Because this game takes place 16 years after the events of Village. That means if we ever see Rose again, it's going to be a 16-year time skip. That means Chris is going to be an old man, Leon's going to be an old man, Jill and Claire, if we ever see them in this timeline, they're going to be old as fuck. And I personally don't like that because it kind of ruins the stakes of anything that could come between Village and Shadows of Rose. Like, for example, at the end of Resident Evil 8 Village, it seemed like it was going to lead to whatever Resident Evil 9 was going to be. Chris found out that the BSAA were using bioweapons, and he was going to go to a BSAA headquarters and find out what was going on. And I thought that was going to be the plot for Resident Evil 9 or maybe a Resident Evil spinoff, and it still might be. But despite that, we know that Chris is still alive come Shadows of Rose, so there'll be no stakes there. We know that he's still doing his Howling Commandos, I think that's what they call them. I may be completely making that up, but we'll still know he's doing essentially the same thing. There's not much change in Chris's story in those 16 years, and that kind of stresses me out if I'm being completely honest with you. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Shadows of Rose. Did you like this DLC? Let me know in the comments, because I know that I loved it. And obviously, consider subscribing if you haven't already. I do TV show discussions, trailer reactions, movie discussions, that sort of thing, but I also talk about survival horror gaming quite a bit. Once again, I have a Resident Evil playlist on this page, and I'm going to talk about Village, the third-person version, a bit more in detail in the next week or so. I'm going to talk about Callisto Protocol, Dead Space, Resident Evil 4 Remake, all the survival horror games that I play I want to talk about on this page. So also consider subscribing if you're into that. Thank you for watching, especially if you watched this far.
Oh my god!
You're so grown up now. And even though I wasn't there with you, I've always watched over you.